feel this is very important and would bring some things into clarity for
Nah,
us.
this on here no shit.
All right,
Stand
I'm
up,
reading this
fuck it
book
down.
called The American Journey. It's the eighth edition and supposedly a combined volume. Anyways, page 320. It's chapter 15 talks about the leaders, governments, and strategies. It says leadership ability, like resources, played an important role in war. Bonds accounted for 66% of the $4 billion that the Union raised to wage the war. Bonds. Like the Confederacy, the federal government issued paper money, paper bills, paper money, bills, derisively known as greenbacks, that was not backed by gold or silver. Hello?
Oh, that's what greenback was?
That's still what a greenback is now. A dollar paper fucking bill. It's green, ain't it?
So not backed by gold.
But these were not backed by gold, and neither are those. And a move that bolstered the value and credibility of the paper currency was this federal government to offset its expense with the country's first income tax, which citizens could pay in greenbacks, that of which are not backed by a gold, but you could pay your income tax, which was a move that bolstered the value and credibility of the paper currency. These financial measures eliminated the need for wage and price controls and rationing and warded off ruinous inflation in the North.
Ruinous inflation.
The Union had more abundant financial resources than the Confederacy, and the federal government was more successful than the Confederate government at developing innovative ways to meet the great cost of the war. Its first recourse was to borrow money by selling long-term interest-bearing bonds and shorter-term interest-bearing treasury notes.
What's the difference? Long term, short term.
Exactly. Together, these bonds accounted for 6% coronavirus of the 4 billion the union raised to wage the COVID virus war. Like the Confederacy, which is the Confederate government to the federal government, issued paper money, bills to Treasury notes and to what was the other thing? Borrowing money
Greenbacks.
by selling interest bearing bonds and shorter term interest bearing treasury notes. These bonds, treasury notes, and bonds were then issued paper money bills as greenbacks, which is not backed by gold or silver. It can't be because that changes every day, anyways, by a standard set to whatever the company guarantees. And now we back then, let's see when this was happening. Um, Let me see if I can find a year that we're talking about. This is mobilization North and South, 1850s to 1862. All right, so neither side was prepared for a major war. The Confederacy lacked a national army. Each southern state had a militia, but by the 1850s, these companies had become more social clubs than fighting units. Aside from privately owned ships and some cap, captured federal vessels, the Confederacy also lacked a navy. The Union had a regular army of 16,000 men, most of whom were stationed west of the Mississippi River. Their major responsibility had been to intervene between white settlers and Indians. how white were they in the Antarctic? Each government augmented these meager military reserves with thousands of new recruits and developed a bureaucracy to mount a war effort. At that same time, the administrations of Presidents Lincoln and Davis secured the loyalty of their civilian populations and devised military strategies for a war of indeterminate duration. How North and how South went about these tasks reflected both the different objectives of the two sides and the distinctive personalities of their leaders, Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis. The day after Major Robert Anderson surrendered Fort Sumter, President Lincoln moved to enlarge his small, scattered army by mobilizing state militias for 90 days. 4 states, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee, refused the call and seceded from the Union. About 1/3 of the officer corps of the regular army, including some of the highest ranking officers, resigned their commissions to join the Confederacy. Still, Lincoln seemed likely to meet his 75,000 troops. Lincoln's modest 90-day call-up reflected the general belief, North and South, that the war would end quickly. Not everyone thought that the war would be brief. William T. Sherman, who had recently headed a Louisiana military academy and would become one of the Union's few great commanders, he wrote in April of 1861, "I think it is to be a long war, very long, much longer than any politicians think." Northerners closed ranks behind the president after the Confederacy's attack on Fort Sumter. So this is our America in America with each other fighting in America, each Americans' territory thing. What were they called back then? Not Americans, Confederacies. Southerners, Northerners, Easterners, Westerners. But they're fighting each other and effing blowing up things. Attack of Fort Sumter. Southerners were equally eager to support their new nation, but somehow we're this whole nation suddenly with all states combined through a United States, but divided through Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, Arkansas, Colorado, California, Connecticut, all of those. And anyways, appeals. Yeah, I cannot believe what I'm about to read. Is this why they say you can make an appeal? Northerners closed ranks behind the president after the Confederacy's attack on Fort Sumter. Southerners were equally eager to support their new nation. Appeals to God were commonplace on both sides, like Commonwealth. The feeling that a holy war was unfolding energized recruits. A war fever gripped the North and South America. North America's North and South. Not including Central, Southern America, South America, whatever. But what we're doing here. As war fever gripped North and South, volunteers on both sides rushed to join, quickly filling the quotas of both armies. By early spring of 1862, however, the Confederate government was compelled to order the first general draft in American history. He was compelled. How? By whom? The draft where? Y'all's drafting all over the place, anyways. It required 3 years service for men. Required what? The compilation between 18 and 35, a range then that went from 17 to 50. Now they have a Confederate government, a federate government, to then include a Confederate Congress. Where is the Federate Congress then? Wouldn't to have that if it's two sides opposing but working together but fighting in their collusion of compulsory provisions on upon everybody else's living? Anyways, I mean, it's real easy just to keep whatever the territory of all that's inclusive safe in as for and abroad. But to this level, that's been from 1850s to what words are now being introduced into a new generation. I kind of am feeling a not wholly, but a very much unfolding something of compulsory. And so the Confederate Congress then added a compulsory re-enlistment provision. After they enlisting you by a compelling order, first general draft in America. At that point, the only way a recruit could get out of the army was to die or desert. Desert. How do you say that word? Desert? Desert. Strawberry shortcake would be desert.
Desert.
Oh, desert.
Desert, and
desert. Like
all
take yourself
spelled the
out.
same way.
Or desert. I don't know. All right, whatever. The Confederate draft law. Who would know there was a Confederate draft law? Like law is not just law like la. When you have military law, crime law, common law, color law, code law, case law, Confederate draft law, housing law, the Confederate draft law allowed several occupational exemptions because, they already brought in that first little tax thing through the greenback things. Among them was an infamous provision that allowed one white man on any plantation with more than 20 slaves to be excused from service. This is like that automatic auto enlisting us people who file for our Social Security or these disability approvals to obtain some sort of income that would be wealthy enough their end, but managing our end under their allowed minimum thresholds, accounting for your disability by an order of departments. We are now taken in this loop trying to obtain what the privilege is to the occupation and then the service to be provided by whom would be receiving millions of dollars into their departments and then still got this acquisition way of putting us at blame on a default to take from us what we are in light in view and told that's a service for us to go and get approved and validated by our disability or our wants and need now that we can retire and get our social security that's been deducted out of all of these lifetimes now from whence 1850s of what it started as greenbacks and bonds and treasury notes to social security numbers now. Okay. And 20 slaves to be one white man on any plantation. Where? On any plantation, where? With more than 20 slaves? White or what? Slave to be excused from service. That white man on any plantation among them was such an infamous provision. We don't ever call these provisions infamous. By the way, like it's really like under the table with only us kind of knowing what this provision is, but we'll put this in front of your face outlined on a sign when you come in that you have to be shirt, shoes, or no service. You know what I'm saying? But the Confederate draft law allowed several occupational exemptions, and that's what I was going to say too. The exemptions with the Social Security or with any of these other kind of buildings, that of which is local governmental affiliated acquisitioners that can liquidate upon any time they please because you failed to do some sort of something, and to which they already have all of their exemptions now made through credit lines where they're basically the recipient before you applicant become a recipient. What even a native born is to be natively born by these people who have created confederacies along the lines of Americas, to which these generals were coming in to then be the people in between and mediator to act in between these Indians and these white colonel officers, so to say. Like, what were they then? The fuck is a white anyway? And a caucus at that, Caucasian. You bring in the Asian to the cauc. That's what? Like, we just gotta, come on, learn this stuff, figure out, and to know by discernment the substitute that skin becomes through an enlightening process, but it doesn't stop the fact that we are all enlivened, enlived to what image we are supposed to be in our munitive plant state of being. But I'm gonna stop with that and keep going with this real quick. I'm at 18 minutes already. Dang, can only put up 10 minutes. So okay. So the initial flush of enthusiasm was all right. The reason for this exemption was to ensure the security and productivity of large plantations, not to protect the privilege, but it led some Southerners to conclude that the struggle had become a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. The initial flush of enthusiasm faded in the North as well, responding to a call for additional troops. Some northern states initiated a draft turning the summer of 1862, and in 1863, Congress passing an enrollment act, a draft law like the Confederate draft, which allowed for occupational exemptions, that is allowing a draftee to hire a substitute, aroused resentment. So we don't like each other. You aroused my anger. I'm resenting you, and I'm choosing you as my substitute to go draft their war for my draft for your, now it's yours. As long as it was allowed. Among working class Northerners, anger at the draft as well as poor working conditions sparked several riots during 1863, from 1862 to 1863. But the North was less dependent on conscription than was the South. So who's conscripting what? Only 8% of the Union's soldier, North or Southern soldier unions, I don't know, who's the Confederates, who's the Federals. Compared to 20% of the Confederacy. So 8% of the Union soldiers were drafted compared to 20% of the Confederacy's Union soldiers drafted. The complaints of many rank and file soldiers may give the impression that only people of lesser or modest means fought. But in fact, the armies of both sides included men from all walks of life, from common laborers to clerks to bankers. But that one white man at the plantation with them 20 slaves, he gets to stay. And then that one white man who got a resentment and got aroused by this one, he can substitute that one to come fight for him. And so all walkers and all laborers of life, from clerks to bankers, and well, then you become a naval, straight out an underdetermined number of women, typically disguised as men, also served in both armies. Like, why would even you have to disguise if there's all lurks and clerks and bankers and shit? Most of those you find as women, right? Personally, I find a lot of clerks and bank tellers to be women, receptionists and things as such. But perhaps as many as 300 women joined the Union ranks. And about half that number, not only 300 joined Union ranks, but half that number enlisting in the Confederate Army. They joined for the same reasons as men: adventure, patriotism, and glory. What? Glory is in that warship. So that's this video for now.